Got some information here that can help you find your soul and your soul's purpose, and then slowly begin to set it free once you understand this information. This information is very watered down. It is the tip of the spiritual and occult iceberg, in my opinion, one of them anyway. And it is in a textbook called The History and Philosophy of Psychology by Man Chung and Michael E. Hyland. This is chapter 12. And in chapter 12, there are some key figures and key philosophies that have personally transformed my life before I knew about them. I was applying these principles. I was coming to the same realizations that they are going to make in this chapter. And it is not for the faint of heart. Just to let you know, you need to be willing to have a profound willingness to self-reflect. If you cannot do that, then you will not be able to understand or download this information. Not at this time. So ask yourself if you're ready to self-reflect, and if you're ready to use what you've reflected on to transcend out of barriers. This will bring light to barriers that you did not know were there, if this resonates with you in this way. That being said, let's begin. Chapter 12. Existential and Phenomenological Philosophies. The previous chapter describes some ideas of existential and phenomenological psychologists. To quickly recap on some of these ideas, Kelly is essentially putting forward a notion of self, which says that we are free individuals who can freely choose the constructs that we use to relate to the world. We are not victims of the past or of circumstances. Maslow believes in self-actualization, which implies a striving towards becoming the person we really are. Similarly, Rogers postulated a notion of a free, subjective, and unique self, which strives towards developing our real, genuine, or authentic self, who we really are, instead of becoming who we should become, fulfilling the expectation of others or the crowd. Frankl is saying that we can exercise our will to create meaning for ourselves, by which he means goals, missions, and assignments in life. We determine whether to give in to conditions or to stand up to them. We determine whether to take a stand towards, i.e., a sense of intentionality, one's limited situation or one's fate in order to fulfill a meaning. May spoke of the three modes of being: existential guilt and anxiety, and the notion of emptiness and loneliness that many of us experience in these modern times. All these ideas, in fact, reflect the complex philosophical concepts with which philosophers from the existential and phenomenological traditions are particularly concerned. The names of some of the well-known existential or phenomenological philosophers have already been mentioned at the beginning of the last chapter. What we wish to do in this chapter is to sketch some of their philosophical thoughts. In particular, we wish to focus on the philosophical thoughts of Søren Kierkegaard, Friedrich Nietzsche, Franz Brentano, Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, and Jean-Paul Sartre. As you will see, their philosophical thoughts very much set the basis for ideas mentioned in the previous chapter. Kierkegaard. Søren Kierkegaard was a Danish philosopher, and generally speaking, was the founder of existentialism. He was born in Copenhagen and spent most of his life there. When he was born, his father was 56 years old and his mother was 44. He was close to his father, Michael Kierkegaard, who insisted that his son should achieve a high standard of Latin and Greek. His father was a strict and authoritarian figure who had a dominant influence on Kierkegaard. From an early age, his father taught Kierkegaard religious education and brought him up to absolutely respect and obey not only Christian laws, but also he himself. Kierkegaard's unquestioning obedience to his father was evident in his being compelled to dress as no other boys did. It was also evident in his hardly ever being allowed to go out of the home. Instead, his father would take his hand and walk back and forth in the room with him. In their walk or journey, Kierkegaard would decide the destination, but during the journey, his father would describe everything he saw. This upbringing was so dominating that even at the age of 22, Kierkegaard was still affectionately subservient to his father and did not strike out with his own independence or express his own talents. That is, he had never found his own self and understood who he was. Rather, he followed his father's teaching and imitated and inherited some of his father's characteristics and experiences. Unfortunately, Kierkegaard's father suffered from melancholy, which also affected him. At some time in his life, Kierkegaard stopped practicing his religion. Instead, he lived a life of pleasure. However, the melancholy which resulted in his childhood continued to affect him. Thus, Kierkegaard became interested in how we can be saved from despair. In doing so, he returned to his studies and in the end became a Lutheran pastor. He was an extremely religious person and was in severe disagreement with the teaching of the Danish state church. He thought that the church was distorting the real message of Christ. His views were, however, not recognized until many years after his death. He later was engaged to Regine Olsen, a 17-year-old woman. However, he later realized that he was in fact unable to share his life with anyone else or live out the role of being a Lutheran pastor. He then broke off the engagement and lived a solitary life as an author. The three spheres of existence. Kierkegaard believed that one should not view philosophical inquiry in terms of the construction of systems or the analysis of concepts. Instead, one should view it in terms of the expression of one's own existence, of that individual. For him, to understand or examine our own thoughts is to examine our own existence as opposed to some external assessments which are based on some objective and impersonal standard. Kierkegaard talked about the three spheres of existence, namely the aesthetic, the ethical, and the religious. The aesthetic sphere suggests a kind of immediacy prior to judgment. It is identified as pleasure and avoidance of pain. In this sphere of existence, all the phenomena presented as aesthetic are pre-ethical. That is, the notions of right and wrong, good and evil, virtue and vice are not relevant in this sphere. This aesthetic sphere of existence is seen as amoral as opposed to immoral. It is considered to be composed of romantic hedonism and good fortune. People who live aesthetically have no control over themselves or their own situations. They live for the moment or immediacy, and for that which gives them entertainment and excitement. They lack commitment. They may think one thing and then change their minds and think the opposite. They change according to their moods. Their lives tend to lack continuity, focus, and stability. These people allow external factors, external circumstances, or happenings to affect and indeed govern their behavior. They do not try to develop a coherent pattern in their lives and arrive at some unity in themselves. They do not try to discover what they should be. This does not mean to say that these people are only governed by their own impulses and unable to reflect upon themselves. They are able to do the latter, but it creates a great deal of despair because it makes them aware of the fact that their entire life rests upon uncertain foundations which do not have any meaning. Such despair is inevitable, in particular, when they realize that a higher mode of existence is an absolute requirement, namely the ethical phase. However, many of them are unwilling to enter it. For those who are willing to take a leap from the aesthetic to the ethical sphere, they will start focusing on moral norms rather than pleasure as the criteria of the good life. Kierkegaard is not talking here about the normal development that people go through when learning to be good by, say, not hurting others. This learning to be good is simply learning to obtain rewards that our society can offer us by being good to others. To get such rewards by being good to others is still the aesthetic phase. For Kierkegaard, the move from the aesthetic phase to the ethical phase is characterized by despair and choice for oneself. People experience despair because they need to give up the aesthetic phase in which being good is simply a means to its ends. To enter into the ethical phase is to choose, to accept, and to become the self that they have chosen to accept. What this means is that the self they have chosen to accept is not a product of some legislation from society. Instead, it is like a product of self-creation. This does not mean that this notion of self only possesses its own ideas. On the contrary, the way in which this self relates to itself is influenced by its relationships with others. This self is responsible for choosing how all the relationships will be organized and constructed. They can freely break away from what others are thinking and doing. Such freedom they must accept. As was mentioned above, the ethical people are those who choose themselves. Choosing oneself is associated with the notions of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, and self-realization. While the aesthetic people are preoccupied with the externals, the ethical people focus on themselves and their own nature. They focus on the fact that they are human beings with talents, passions, and indeed ability to organize and control their own destiny. That is, they are consciously aware of the fact that they are responsible for themselves. They do not believe that their nature, e.g., personality and disposition, is something which cannot be changed and to which they can only submit. They can reflect upon themselves. By reflecting upon themselves, they can realize who they are and what they truly aspire to become, i.e., the self that they wish to shape for themselves. They do not simply give in to the control of external circumstances and other contingencies. They do not simply absorb, but break away from what others say or what everyone is doing. Now, the self that ethical people wish to develop does not exist in isolation. Quite the contrary, it exists in relation to its public and external environments and circumstances in life. This self is also a social and civic self. There are duties, rules, and obligations which this self takes on. However, this does not mean that these duties would restrict or limit the freedom of this self. Quite the contrary, they identify themselves as active members of society. They are one with these duties and fulfill them in their own individual way. Kierkegaard believed that the foregoing two phases are incomplete. We can only close the gap by moving into the religious phase, the third phase. To him, the religious phase is the highest stage in our human existence. We need to realize that the individual is essentially sinful, and that is the source of untruth. We can only save ourselves by accepting the eternal salvation offered by God, a transcendent being who redeemed us. This understanding is beyond human reason, e.g., reason would find it difficult to comprehend how the eternal and transcendent God can come to earth as a temporal and finite human being who could redeem us through salvation. Kierkegaard looked at religion in terms of our desire to want to become aware of this transcendent power in the universe. He, in other words, did not look at religion in the form of a belief adopted by an institution, i.e., the church. He, in fact, criticized the institution of Christianity altogether and claimed that the church only conveyed the false meaning of Christianity to others. For Kierkegaard, the true meaning of Christianity is all about us, as individuals, standing alone in front of this transcendent God. In order to embrace God or God's salvation for us, one has to take a leap of faith, which means abandoning human rationality. One also has to suspend the ethical, i.e., the socially prescribed norms, and instead adopt the God's ultimate definition of good and evil. The latter is far superior to that defined by society. To illustrate this, Kierkegaard gave an example based on the biblical story of Abraham, the father of faith, who followed God's command to kill his son. Of course, we were told that God simply wanted to test Abraham's faith and that he did not let the killing happen. Reality or public reason cannot help us decide whether Abraham was truly faithful by following God's command or whether he was simply a mad murderer. We can only decide for ourselves on the basis of religious faith, a kind of individual passion which cannot be changed by others or the church. One has to believe by virtue of the absurd. Christian faith is not simply one of the concerns for the church. Instead, we as human beings should try our utmost to achieve it. For him, we can only understand our true self when we develop faith. Nietzsche. Friedrich Nietzsche was born at Röcken in Germany, although he later rejected his German origins. His father was a Lutheran minister, and his mother was the daughter of a Lutheran minister. He studied classical philology at Bonn and Leipzig, where he left a good impression with Professor Friedrich Nietzsche. With his help, Nietzsche secured a post at Basel, where he lectured on classics of Greek philosophy. He later became a Swiss citizen and a full professor at Basel. He was a friend of Wagner, who lived at Tribschen near Lucerne. However, he later disagreed with Wagner's ideas. In 1878, he resigned from Basel due to ill health. The fact is that throughout his life, Nietzsche's health was poor. His doctors kept advising him to preserve his bad eyesight. They asked him to read and write less. However, he paid no attention to this advice. He battled against his severe migraine and gastric pains by doing long walks and writing. He lived a solitary life, where he continued his philosophical pursuit. In 1889, he was thought to suffer from mental illness, and his sister later looked after him for the rest of his life. It was Nietzsche's sister who acted as an interpreter for his ideology. Some philosophers believe that Nietzsche was a moralist as opposed to a philosopher. Here we go. He stressed the importance of taking up certain attitudes to life. However, he believed that most of us are, in fact, incapable of doing so. On the other hand, he referred to the Übermensch, the Superman, who is indeed capable of doing so and will transcend guilt, e.g., guilt from religion, embedded within ourselves, and thus experience a joyous and guiltless life as one who can master his or her own life and instinctive drives. The life of the Superman is meant to be something which is entirely positive and symbolizes complete power without any negativity. It is the kind of life which is, to many of us, unachievable because we are simply human, all too human. Nietzsche was influenced by a philosopher called Arthur Schopenhauer, who spoke about the notion of will as a thing in itself. Nietzsche adopted his notion of will, but rejected the idea of the will as a thing in itself. Indeed, he never liked that kind of metaphysical truth. To Nietzsche, we cannot access truths independent of our human points of view. Truth can only be found within the superiority of a subjective point of view in securing dominance. In other words, truth is power. This sense of truth from Nietzsche is somewhat similar to that of Protagoras, an ancient Greek philosopher, who claimed that man is the measure of all things. However, Nietzsche believed that ordinary people are often afraid to exercise their will to power in order to achieve a point of view which transcends ordinary ones. Thus, some would say that Nietzsche is essentially in favor of relativism, anti-objectivity, i.e., truths corresponding to facts, and to an extent, anti-rationality. He was thought to be an existentialist in the sense that he emphasized the importance of existence above reason. To Nietzsche, some perspectives or viewpoints are better than others. Also, the better is the stronger. The kind of truth, knowledge, and indeed morality that we ordinary people emphasize is, according to him, a kind of emphasis on falsification and distortion which people carry out for the continuation of their lives. But this kind of ordinary morality is a kind of slave morality. Ordinary morality and conscience are simply the kinds of attitudes internalized in us through social relationships or influences of the crowd. This morality is simply a set of rules or customs imposed on us by society. This means that such morality is, in essence, opposite to what is natural in us. The Superman mentioned earlier, on the other hand, can transcend this kind of ordinary morality, go beyond ordinary socially determined beliefs and attitudes, and go beyond good and evil in the ordinary sense. This ordinary morality, to Nietzsche, is a kind of slave morality, as opposed to the views and attitudes of the master, the Superman. The master embraces and uses power willingly in order to achieve a point of view which transcends ordinary ones. The slaves are, on the other hand, afraid of the Superman. Not only that, the slaves, that is to say, those who are inferior because of their inability to use power, also resent the Superman because he or she has power that they do not have. According to Nietzsche, the Superman is a totally free spirit and a joyous one, which are all positive attributes. Anything is possible for him and her, and so called truth and science are in fact nothing. Nietzsche is a nihilist in that sense, despite the fact that he might not have seen himself that way. For Nietzsche, the only reality that we can have is that in which we can exercise our ability to use our will to power to achieve a point of view which transcends ordinary ones and to enjoy the freedom resulting from it. In contrast to the notion of the Superman is the notion of the last man. The last man, according to Nietzsche, signifies the lowest common denominators of humanity, that is, the crowd. Nietzsche did not like these people at all. One can argue that Nietzsche's ideal is a romantic one, which almost has nothing to do with reality or the reality that ordinary people know about. However, Nietzsche would argue that there is a historical reason as to why his ideal looks so remote from ordinary people seeing reality. According to Nietzsche, historically speaking, the kind of power that he talked about was seen to be bad, and the masters were made to adopt the view from the slaves on what is good. Consequently, the masters became unable to exercise their will and later turned this upon themselves in the form of self-aggression. This resulted in repression and bad conscience, which became prevalent in ordinary society. This is why ordinary people do not recognize the notion of power and indeed the notion of Superman that Nietzsche talked about. Nietzsche believed that the role of religion in general and Christianity in fact encouraged the slave morality. Not surprisingly, he did not believe in God. That, my friends, was the most impactful part of the chapter for me. But I will continue. Brentano. Franz Brentano was a German philosopher and psychologist. He was educated at Würzburg, Munich, Berlin, and Münster universities. He completed his PhD at Tübingen University in 1862. He lectured at Würzburg and at the University of Vienna. In 1864, Brentano became a Roman Catholic priest in Austria and received training in scholasticism, through which he became familiar with the works of Aristotle. However, he left the church in 1873 due to his involvement with controversy over the doctrine of papal infallibility. He became blind during his last few years of life. Brentano was interested in a whole range of philosophical topics, including ethics and psychology. In addition to his influence upon the German-speaking philosophers, he influenced G.F. Stout, a well-known philosopher-psychologist in Britain. Brentano talked about the ontology of mind. He believed that psychology should start from an empirical perspective. Empirical psychology is defined as the science of inner conscious experience or inner conscious awareness. He believed that our conscious awareness is intentionally related to external objects and at the same time reflexively related to itself. That is, there is an intentional structure in our minds. Brentano believed that we should try to understand it, and in so doing, should arrive at a general view of the entire human consciousness. To help him achieve this, he used an approach called descriptive phenomenology, which is a pure description of the elements of our consciousness, as opposed to the physiological makeup of our conscious phenomena. This descriptive phenomenology tells us that the nature of our minds is determined by a number of mental acts. Our minds always include objects intentionally within themselves, are always directed upon their objects, or are intentionally related to their objects. What Brentano was proposing here is the idea that these objects have intentional in existence. In dash existence. They possess an internal relation to the mental act and do not exist except in that relation. There are three kinds of mental act, namely 1. Ideas or thoughts, 2. Judgment, and what he called 3. The phenomena of love and hate. There's a hierarchical structure in these three acts. According to Brentano, ideas or thoughts are fundamental phenomena. The other two types presuppose them. Firstly, we are thinking about, for example, a red rose. So a rose is present in our consciousness. Finally, we need to judge that we are really thinking about a red rose. Thirdly, we take an emotional stand towards this rose. This stand would mean adopting the attitude of liking or disliking, loving or hating towards the rose. At the same time, each mental act, for example, the act of thinking, while directed towards an object, say a rose, is reflexively directed towards itself. When we are thinking about a rose, we are at the same time aware of ourselves thinking about it. In other words, our consciousness is conscious of itself. Husserl. Brentano influenced many students, one of whom was called Edmund Husserl. The latter played a central role in his intellectual development called phenomenology. Husserl was a mathematician by training and received his PhD in 1881. After having worked with Carl Theodor Weierstrass, a mathematician, Husserl moved to Vienna, where he was a student of Brentano from 1884 to 1886. Partly due to the influence of Brentano, he decided to pursue philosophy. Husserl lectured in Halle, Göttingen, and Freiburg. Husserl took philosophy extremely seriously. For him, if he lost faith in philosophy, he would have also lost faith in himself. Husserl believed that philosophy is a form of science. It should enable us to find some indubitable and objective truths which could set the basis for human knowledge. To treat philosophy as a science is first and foremost to seek complete clarity and certainty. Philosophers, to Husserl, should take nothing for granted and should bear no presuppositions or assumptions. All statements and concepts need to be examined before we can say there are true statements or valid concepts. Husserl's desire to find clarity set the basis for his first philosophical inquiries. The first mention that he used in his philosophical inquiries is called phenomenology. The main function of it is to describe phenomena or describe essences in general. This descriptive method separates phenomenology from the traditional philosophical practices where philosophers engage in deductive procedure. They try to deduce what must be true of the world from prior well-established assumptions. But in phenomenology, they look at the world and describe what it is like. They look at it without any prior assumptions or presuppositions. According to Husserl, phenomenologists need to perform an epoch, a term used by the Greek skeptics, which means suspending judgment of the objects existing in our consciousness. So when we analyze some phenomena or the essences of some objects that we have perceived, we should suspend or bracket off our assumptions or presuppositions about them. In doing so, we can see this phenomenon as it is in itself, i.e., its essence. Later, however, Husserl did not think that this view was complete. Thus, he advocated what he called transcendental phenomenology. In transcendental phenomenology, bracketing basically played a more radical role. Mhm. According to Husserl, we have to bracket off the actual world and try to arrive at something which can no longer be bracketed off. What cannot be bracketed off then? For Husserl, our individual ego or consciousness cannot be bracketed off and will remain after bracketing all other phenomena. Such consciousness is the one absolute, the pure consciousness, and presupposes an ego, which is called a transcendental ego. The transcendental ego is the precondition of all meaning. That is, it alone cannot be bracketed off or thought away because it is presupposed in all thinking or in every act of consciousness or experience, even in the activity of bracketing itself. This transcendental ego is basically saying that objects are constituted by pure consciousness and that nothing can be conceived without being objects of our pure consciousness. Whatever exists in the world exists as objects for our pure consciousness. Husserl's view on the transcendental ego was rather too extreme at times. He went as far as to claim that this transcendental ego will still exist even when the entire world has vanished. This transcendental ego exists as an absolute phenomenon. Love how it says that it was too extreme. It's truth. Let me continue. Heidegger. Husserl's work had a direct impact and an immediate influence on Martin Heidegger, who was a student of Husserl and who succeeded him in the chair of philosophy at Freiburg in 1928. Heidegger was born in 1889 in Baden. He worked at the universities of Freiburg and in 1915 and Marburg in 1923. He returned to Freiburg in 1928. In 1933, Heidegger became the first National Socialist rector at the University of Freiburg. One can see elements of his extreme nationalism in some of his writing. He resigned his position in 1934. From 1945 to 1951, he was forbidden to teach because of his association with the Nazi Party. Apparently, his support for Nazism was motivated by his discontent with societies with giant technology and industries, i.e., USA and USSR at that time. His support, in other words, was not motivated by anti-Semitism. Heidegger wanted to understand a very important and central question to ourselves, which is, what is being? Seeing. He tried to answer this question using a phenomenological approach. For Heidegger, there are three fundamental aspects of human beings. These aspects are facticity, existentiality, and forfeiture. Facticity refers to the fact that we, as human beings, are always already in the world. That is, we are always being in the world, Dasein, by which he meant we always exist in the middle of a world among other things. We are always fixed and immersed in the physical and day-to-day world. After all, can we be anywhere else? Heidegger believed that Dasein cannot be applied to ordinary objects, but to us as conscious and self-conscious beings. Dasein is always mine. The viewpoint of Dasein is always a personal, individual, or even a solipsistic one. So, when we communicate with others through language, we do so only in a way which is derived from the solitary individual's point of view. Thus, much of what Heidegger has to say about Dasein is concerned with where we stand as an individual in relation to the world. This is why some scholars would classify his philosophy in the school of existentialism. Heidegger talked about things in the world. These things are stuff, Zug, that we can use, Gebrauch. This stuff is at hand, zu handen, for us to handle, hantieren. For Heidegger, human beings are meant to produce or make things. We are surrounded by tools, materials, and indeed opportunities. In other words, while we have been thrown into a world outside of our own making, e.g., we were born with a certain skin color and brought up to speak a certain language, it is up to us to become our own world using certain materials and opportunities. This leads us onto the human aspect of existentiality, which is, in essence, about our ability to make our world truly our own world. The notion of existentiality does not refer to the notion of existence in the sense of something like tables and chairs existing physically. This concept refers to some inner experiences or inner personal existence, i.e., the mental universe, or having a perspective through which our own physical and geographical space and historical environment become our very own. We exist as a kind of being which anticipates the range of possibilities surrounding us. We exist knowing that we are in a certain situation and that we have the power to become what we want to become, as opposed to becoming what we must become. In other words, we always anticipate and aim at what is not yet. We always anticipate and aim at what it is not yet, at possibilities. However, we do all of the above knowing at the same time that we are within the boundaries of the world in which we find ourselves. That is, we are always in the world, of the world, and indeed with the world. While we are determined to be free and make our own destiny, we are at the same time enslaved. We are thrown into the world in which we are determined by our own genetics and environment, which in turn are what we make of them. This leads us onto the final human aspect of forfeiture. The notion of forfeiture means that we sometimes have to forget our own being for particular beings. That is, we inevitably forget our own being, the I, in order to attend to distracting daily affairs or concerns and to the things and people which are surrounding us on a daily basis. We have to attend to the persistent they, the crowd, das Man. In other words, the human being is inevitably public. We live our lives with others and for others, which of course distracts the central important task of becoming who we want to become. The idea above relates to the notion of authentic being. To understand this authentic being, one needs to start with the notion of dread. As we said earlier, we are distracted by daily concerns or affairs and by attending to the persistent they and consequently forget our own being. Now, can we at some point turn back to our own being and face up to it with honesty? The question is whether we can grasp our wholeness rather than simply stay in the they. We can indeed. How? By looking at our moods or the states of our mind at particular moments. But Heidegger was not interested in all of our different moods. He referred to one in particular, which is to him unique and which can help us return from forfeiture of our own being to awareness of our own being. This mood is dread, angst, i.e., anxiety and anguish. This is a kind of mood in which we feel a sense of nothingness. When we see our lives and indeed our own world in its entirety, what do we realize? We realize that the ending of our own world is inevitable, i.e., we are in fact being to death. Being dash to dash death. Being to death. That beyond our existence, we are simply nothing. Our nothingness, that our existence is at the same time open towards an under undetermined future, ultimate groundlessness, and emptiness, which can only be filled by our own choice of actions, and that we are constantly confronting possibilities, the need to make decisions, which in turn mean responsibility. The realization of this fact of life or knowledge of ourselves brings us a sense of dread. When we experience dread, we hear our consciousness, a kind of silent voice which is embedded within us. By attending to our conscience, we then lift ourselves out of our forgetfulness of our being, the forfeiture, and suddenly feel free from the illusion of the they and become authentic. That is, when we attend to this voice, we can lift ourselves out of the forgetfulness of ourselves and take up the responsibility of being ourselves, thereby shifting from forfeiture to authenticity. To take up such a responsibility is a lonely and isolated event. We can only rise from forfeiture to authenticity in isolation from the they. Our consciousness is saying to us that we accept and acknowledge the fact that we have no choice but to be thrown into the world, and yet we have the task of choosing the self that we want to be. Our conscious is saying to us that we ought to confront and face up to our own inner capability. The capability to choose the self that we want to be, as opposed to simply forget ourselves in this or that or the crowd. We ought to make our situations become ours. Sartre. Heidegger's philosophy had a profound influence on Jean-Paul Sartre. Sartre was a philosopher, playwright, novelist, political theorist, and literary critic. He was born in Paris and studied philosophy at the École Normale Supérieure from 1924 to 1928. Then, in 1931, he lectured in philosophy in Le Havre, which he hated immensely. In 1937, he moved back to Paris. The war broke out, and Sartre found himself serving as a meteorologist in the French army. His experience in the war had a significant impact on his life. He wrote about his experience in the war in the form of a few diaries in which his initial philosophical thoughts were formed. In 1940, Sartre was captured and imprisoned. 1 year later, he was released and returned to Paris to teach philosophy. Sartre later gave up his academic career. Instead, he made his living as a writer, combined with his concern for political and social affairs at the time. He joined the Communist Party at the time of the Korean War and then left. He was involved in political affairs, particularly in the struggle for liberation in Algeria and the French opposition to American involvement in Vietnam. In 1964, he was offered the Nobel Prize for Literature, which he refused to accept. When he died, 50,000 people turned up to his funeral. Sartre's writings are diverse. Some are concerned with phenomenological psychology and ontology. In phenomenological psychology, Sartre was concerned with the notion of consciousness. He wanted to describe a particular structure of consciousness. Like Husserl, he wanted to describe it without relying on any taken for granted concepts of human existence. However, although Sartre was using a descriptive phenomenological method that he adopted from Husserl, it became apparent that he, in fact, was gradually drifting away from Husserl and becoming more sympathetic to the approach of Heidegger. Earlier, we talked about Husserl's belief in this notion called transcendental ego. The latter cannot be bracketed off, will remain after bracketing off all other phenomena, is beyond any assumptions about the existence of the world or individual selves, and is the one absolute. The radical nature of this transcendental ego is also reflected by his extreme claim that the ego will still exist, even after the entire world has disappeared. Sartre, however, disagreed. According to Sartre, there is no such thing as transcendental ego. There is no transcendental ego which is detached from the world. Consciousness only makes sense when it is related to our awareness of objects in the world. According to Sartre, consciousness is not a thing which transcends the world or is outside the world. We exist as beings in the world and engage with the world in pursuing our human consciousness. Our intentional acts come from our existence as beings in the world. Consequently, consciousness comes into being because consciousness is defined in terms of its aboutness of something other than consciousness itself. In other words, consciousness and the world are closely interconnected. They love each other. To Sartre, the world is full of meanings as long as we exist as beings in the world. No pure meanings or essences of things are waiting to be discovered by some pure consciousness. Tables, for example, are meaningless if they are not seen in the light of a network of other objects in the world and what humans do with them. If no one uses tables, the meaning or significance of tables would not arise. We humans exist as active beings in the world. We are not passive spectators like our pure ego, like the pure ego. We are thrown into the world in which we have to learn to cope with it. By coping with the world, we experience many objects whose meanings then begin to arise. Of course, Sartre is not saying that the physical world would no longer exist when we die. However, as far as the human world, in the sense of a system of meanings and significances, is concerned, when we die, this world will die with us because those meanings and significance are products of our human activities. So, for Sartre, our human reality is in fact a Dasein being there. That is, we always exist as beings in the world. We are never detached from it. In addition to the above disagreements Sartre had with Husserl, Sartre also distinguished between the notion of existence and essence. The existence of an object A refers to that object A which exists. The essence of object A refers to what object A is. That is, the difference is between thatness and whatness. In the light of this distinction, Sartre talked about freedom. According to Sartre, we are free. We are not determined by an essence because we, in fact, have no essence. We first are or exist, thatness. Then we do things. Through what we do, we create essence, whatness, for ourselves, i.e., We define our own identity. So, our existence precedes our essence. To make this more explicit, according to Sartre, we do not have an essence which predetermines our character or our role in the world. We are determined to be free and create our destiny through our actions. That is, we are responsible for our own choice and indeed what we are. We can never give such responsibility to other people. We cannot define our essence according to some objective standards which lie outside of ourselves. The choices that we make determine what we are. We have to be aware of the fact that such responsibility means that there is no pre existing self. We can create and identify our own selves through what we do, following the initial choice that we have to choose. But such choice is chosen with groundlessness, which consequently creates angst within us. So, it's very tempting to simply abandon our responsibility and pass it on to someone else or something other than ourselves. To pass on such responsibility is to engage in what Sartre called an inauthentic life or bad faith, mauvaise foi, and is a kind of self deception. We deceive ourselves by not facing up to the truth that we are responsible for what we are through what we inevitably choose to do. We deny our own freedom to determine our own future and destiny and to be responsible for it and to view ourselves as fixed objects. We may say this is how other people see us. We simply hold on to the labels, e.g., husband, wife, mother, father, which we believe determine what we will do and subsequently what we are. That is, these labels define our essence. To start, what we are is not determined by our labels because what we are is constantly recreated by virtue of what we choose to do. The idea here is that although we are inevitably classified into different classes or types, this does not mean that the uniqueness or particularity of our experience would no longer exist. Sartre then goes on to talk about different kinds of being or ontological categories, namely being in self, être en soi, being for itself, être pour soi, and being for others, être pour autrui. Being in itself refers to things or non-human being. A physical object or of a table or a chair would be a being in itself. It is an unconscious object or unconscious physical reality. Being for itself refers to consciousness or self-aware beings. A being for itself would be that which is conscious of both itself and others. It is able to be conscious of itself and to be conscious of the fact that it is separate from other beings. We as human beings are conscious of ourselves and of the fact that we are separate from others. This links in with what Sartre called nothingness. That is, we have a kind of intuition in which while we are conscious of a table over there, we are also conscious of the fact that we are not that table. That is, our consciousness arises as an awareness of not being the object of which we are conscious. Because of this intuition, we consist of nothingness or of self-negation. We can make judgments in which we can distinguish individual things, different desires, and alternatives. We can distinguish them by their not being something else. At the same time, When we are conscious of the fact that we are not being the objects of our consciousness, and when we are distinguishing individual things, different desires, etc., by their not being something else, we are also conscious of ourselves being aware of not being the objects of our consciousness, or we are conscious of ourselves being in the process of distinguishing different things. Being for others refers to the kind of being which is derived from their relation to others. Sartre is saying that we recognize phenomena such as guilt and shame. The reason is that guilt and shame result from us existing in relation to others, and from there being other people who are aware of us. The idea here is that the world as it is for us consists of intersubjectivity, which depends on the fact that other people exist. The meaning that we obtain from the world as it is for us also depends on the existence of others. So, our experience of the world is a public world, and our experience of ourselves very much depends on our acceptance of the existence of others. This is how we obtain meaning and significance. As we relate to others, we are conscious of the fact that we are being looked at by others. Others look at us as fixed objects for them. This creates a struggle for us. The struggle is about trying our best to maintain our freedom when other people look at us as fixed objects for them. In other words, other people are a threat to our freedom. This is why Sartre said, hell is other people. But similarly, we are also a threat to the freedom of those others. Since we are conscious of how others see us, we might be ashamed of ourselves. Our shame is associated with us seeing ourselves as being seen by others. Our self-consciousness is, in other words, derived from us taking the viewpoints of our behavior from other people. Yikes. So that was the end of chapter 12. Do you see a key theme here? So I do. The key theme is choice and freedom. The choice may come from our will. Some think our will is inherent in its capabilities, and others think that anyone can learn to fortify the will. I happen to believe the latter. I believe that we are all capable of being Superman. But this is a paradox, because if you don't know you're capable, then how do you learn to know that you're capable so that you can start becoming capable? Some people never do. And so it goes back to what truly is inherent and what is truly not. I may tell myself that I had the ability, that I did not have the ability. I came into the world and grew up in such fear, and thinking that since I broke out of it, anyone can, and anyone can live this free, positive life that Nietzsche is talking about. But wouldn't that be such the words of someone who is already operating in that capacity? I'm not saying I'm a Superman or anything, but I think that we can strive towards that. The striving towards being a Superman and breaking out of the bondage of fear is not unique, is what I'm saying. But if we were going to go off of the fixed object rule, this is where the paradox comes from. The paradox of one half of the audience perceiving the person talking as already predispositioned towards such actions, and the other half agreeing, and therefore using the template to empower their own self because they already agree with that notion that we are all capable. It's a delicate balance of thinking in opposites. And thinking in opposites also provides the 2 points at the bottom of a triangle that allows you to narrow down your viewpoint, which ends up being at the top of both sides of duality. I thought it was very interesting where they talk about the transcendent ego. Okay. So to me, what this is saying, because I could have explained it while we read, but I'd hope that you listen to all the words first and then come back to the commentary afterwards. Because my commentary can throw off the subject matter and influence your opinion before you're done forming your own. So if you are not able to form an opinion about the transcendent ego because it didn't give practical examples, my example is this. They did actually touch on it. They said that the I, they talked about the I. That's where all meaning cannot be bracketed off anymore. Sometimes I, in my mind, call this being in the 9th dimension, the none dimension, where all is nothing and nothing is all, because we are the measure of nothingness. So bracketing off phenomena and meanings and significances down to its core looks like this. If I say Jesus was man, well, it's up to you to believe that or not. Like, it's always subjective. It cannot not be subjective, and that base subjectivity is the only thing that is objective, which comes back to the I. I am the one stating this. And, oh, it's not me saying this, it's the Bible or whatever. This is probably too controversial of an example for you to stick with the general idea and not pick apart the content of the idea. But the point is, I'm only ever the one speaking my opinion. Or if I'm hearing other people's opinions or even their expression of facts. What is a fact? A fact is something that we all agree upon. I agree. You agree. Peter agrees. Sally agrees. And each individual agrees. That is inevitable. So we cannot not be inevitable about our ultimate authority in reality's meaning. It all comes down to me. And that goes for all. It is the same thing. Because I is a fixed object. It, by nature of its existence. Oh, did I just make that up? I. I say that. And it is my truth. So there's no such thing as the. Because if you do not believe it, then that does not make it the lie. And it does not make it the truth if you agree. It all comes down to you, which means I. It all comes down to I. I is the transcendent ego. So what we're trying to do when we take on a higher viewpoint of things is understanding, okay, this perspective says this perspective says that, and deriving enough meaning from both to understand that it has to come down to you so that you can make the most intentional, authentic decision, knowing both sides. And you don't even have to know the details about both sides of a thing, especially when it's not that big of a deal. Like if you're not making a huge important decision, and even then, you may not know what an important decision may look like for you, besides things that are common sense. Common sense is useful. This chapter is talking about going against the crowd, but common sense is a tool that you can use to measure your own authenticity because it's public. The common is the public, and you can use it to bounce off of or absorb and stick to. It's a measure of self. All is a measure of self. That is why we are beings for ourselves, because reality exists for us to make meaning out of it. Did I have any more thoughts? I have a lot of thoughts, but yeah. So that would mean that when Nietzsche talks about exercising your will to power in order to achieve a point of view which transcends ordinary ones, ordinary ones are societal ones, institutional ones, but it's not really specified here in this particular book what he means by ordinary ones. Ordinary ones don't have to be just common sense or just the masses and just the sheep and the herd and all of that. If you derive meaning that happens to align with it, then that is itself an authentic conclusion that you have drawn that can make you a better person all the same, a more self aware person all the same. However, what is ordinary to me is the exemplification of objectivity, um, of arguments where people are arguing, this is what it is. No, this is what it is. A transcendent one just is concerned with the self. But the only way you can truly be concerned with yourself is to learn your true self through these two falsely objective opposing stances. Otherwise, you'll get lost in the dualism. You'll get lost and you will become ordinary because you're taking on some viewpoint. Pink is the best color ever, and that's my view. You're lost because if someone says no, black is the best color. These are cheap examples because they're an example of preference, which really cannot be argued. Preferences are not things that people fear. What people fear is objectivity and quote unquote fact. So this is what causes the fear of exercising the will and to gain power. The power is not in what you like or dislike. So a better example would be Nietzsche is a philosopher and not a moralist. And then you put your viewpoints there. But even then, yeah, let's stick with that. I was going to say, even then, the example is denoting something outside the self, which is kind of easier to deflect than something that you're taking on directly as a truth concerning yourself. So, but you get the idea. This is powerful stuff. And it's interesting that it goes over most people's minds because of the fear and the blockage of not being ready and willing to die for yourself and die to your ordinary self. That's what makes it understandable that slaves exist. Spiritual slaves, societal slaves, 9 to 5 slaves. Sorry, not sorry. I understand I was there, but to really learn the truth about who you are involves a death to the person that you think you ought to be. And death is a life-altering process. And so it is understandable that when you are striving for peace, striving for harmony, striving for simplicity, and striving for routine, that this would be scary enough to not entertain. You don't want to die. I get it. That's why there are 1%ers in the population or less who pursue certain things and succeed. But the ones who do, who are now 1% of the population, will tell you that all it took was a shift in mindset. They might say it's hard work, but the hard work derives from that simple decision to change your mindset. The changing of the mind is a death of ordinary consciousness. But it's a simple decision to say, yes, I am in fact Superman, and be willing to accept the unknown of how this will manifest into your new reality that you're not familiar with in the first place. The Catholic Church also will say that sin is public. This is where they're getting it from. By nature of our consciousness, which gets forged, strengthened, increases in virtue, or is seen as immoral, all of that is due to public perception and relative perception. Public just means relative, because something else has to be conscious of something else for that measurement to exist. So a measurement is a looking at, and your own point of view is not the only thing that you look at. I mean, that looks, because you're here in the world. So it's math. Like, this is how math came into being, because of the awareness of differences. But differences have to come from at least two or multiples. So multiple angles, multiple perspectives, multiple numbers, multiple items, multiple groups. Then you determine what the identity, what the essence of a number is. Are you number one? What's your number? And so by religious phase, also what Kierkegaard was talking about, poor Kierkegaard, he's using terminology based off of his trauma. But the religious stage of life, that might have gone over some people's minds too. Because what does he mean? Like, you cannot be religious without a religion, right? But he mentions, well, this book does not mention adhering to a religion, especially not Christianity in the way that the church made it. The church made Christianity a religion. So what does he mean to live a religious life not as according to Christian society or the church? It's your consciousness. It's Christ consciousness. And being dedicated, how they say, I religiously go to the gym. Religiosity is discipline. So you would be dedicated to the conquest or to the pursuit of spiritual discipline to cultivate faith. Faith is having like this empathy and knowing of your awareness and your will in the face of the unknown that has nothing to do with rationalizing or intellectualizing. It's having confidence, and yet humility and love for self in the face of the unknown. If you know something, or if you strive to know everything and avoid change in your life and strive for stability, if that's all your life is about the preventing of chaos and the preventing of the unknown, all of that, where's your faith? It's not there. Christian or no. So that's why also he says ethical people are the ones who choose themselves. Choosing oneself is associated with notions of self-knowledge, self-acceptance, self-realization. Notice what would happen, what effect this would give, since you know the context of it's saying knowledge, acceptance, and realization without the self. Oh, that means knowledge of what? Oh my gosh, I gotta learn. Acceptance of what? Oh, it must be all people everywhere. Realization of the objective God. Then where's yourself that you choose? Because if you adhere to this, that would be choosing those things. Choosing, let's say, choosing God. Choosing God, or choosing life, light. Let's just, all of those words that end up into the category of spiritual enlightenment. Choosing that is associated with the notions of knowledge, acceptance, realization. Does that not make sense? It makes sense from that point of view. Um, but since ancient times and to this day, when people lose themselves in the process, they have gained nothing and they end up punished, especially because they believe in punishment. The poor souls. They end up suffering ultimately when the whole point was to avoid suffering because you are learning enough and knowing things and accepting other people and realizing the truth. So, and these people will even say, well, I know that we can't avoid suffering and suffering is inevitable. Watch yourself. Feel yourself when you say that. Do you feel anything or is it all up here? Do you know that in your head or your heart or your experience? So be careful because the ethical thing is to lose yourself in this society. But the real ethical thing is to choose yourself and to preserve yourself. This allows other people to know. This allows other people to learn acceptance and let people realize things that they need to realize because you are only concerned with yourself. And if you go back to thinking about the fixed object of the I, which means that the I in and of itself includes all, it includes nothing. It all comes down to I. This incorporates me, you, he, she, they. All of those are smokescreen words for the I. Because the I of you is the I of me. I cannot stress this in a practical way, unfortunately, at this time. But this is like the authentic conclusion that I have come to that has changed my life. Self-knowledge begets knowledge of others. Self-knowledge reflects knowledge of others. Self-knowledge allows others to know themselves and to know you at the same time. Because something becomes hidden and something becomes falsified when you are just concerned with knowing other things, knowing other people. What are you doing? Why are you like this? This thing is insert ethical or unethical virtue or value here. And some people will fall for that. Ordinary people, maybe. But other people, the whole time that you're throwing the finger at other things and like pointing to something, oh, what is this? Or how can we accept that? Other people are looking at you the whole time. Some people will follow your finger, your eyes. They will follow where your attention directs them. Other people will look at you. I will look at you. I don't move my eyes or my body language when you talk and you will point. Because there's also a thing called peripheral vision that people are also unconscious to. Peripheral vision should be a key part of awareness that people use as a tool to see the whole picture. And they don't. They spend too much energy moving their entire eyeballs and their entire head or their entire body to get a sense of where you are trying to point your attention to. And thus, they lose their power every single day. If they choose to distract themselves by the they or by those things, those people, this is how we come out of being. Be with yourself at all times. There's a way to do it, and it's called creativity and imagination and the conquering of fear. So I will stop there before I ramble on further, but I will come back to a lot of these concepts in later videos. In the meantime, thank you for watching.